Contrary to their name, silent movies were very rarely silent. For the early cinemagoer, silent films were very much the same audiovisual spectacle that we watch today, albeit with less sophisticated technological setups. The films of the late 19th and early 20th century were largely defined by what Tom Gunning refers to as the cinema of attractions. Unlike the narrative movies that we've become accustomed to, early films focused more on spectacle, a film's entertainment value coming from its realistic depiction of life itself. These movies didn't really have plots or characters, they were more just slices of life intended to wow audiences by showing them things that they recognised in a wholly new way. People have always been fascinated by new technology. Think about the abundance of tech expos which pop up across the year, heralding the promise of new and never-before-seen gadgets. In the same way, early cinema was an exercise in technological spectacle. To see a moving image on screen was, in of itself, spectacular. But tied to this spectacle were also simultaneous developments in audio technology, and effects which would form a complementary relationship with cinema until the two were finally married in the dawn of the talkies. To trace the history of sound in silent film, we need to start at the travelling exhibition culture of the late 19th century. From the 1890s to the late 1950s, the travelling exhibition circuit saw showmen travel from location to location, showcasing lectures supported by slides produced by a magic lantern, a device that projected images using glass. These exhibitions were exceedingly popular at the time, with exhibitionist D.W. Robertson having 247 shows between 1987 and 1898. The magic lantern itself was one of the attractions of these exhibits. Often the lectures existed more as a means by which to demonstrate the awesome projection abilities of the device, than something to be interested in without the aid of an image. But whilst the spectacle of the lantern was certainly enough to keep audiences interested, it was the simultaneous invention of the phonograph, a primitive record player of sorts, in 1877 by Thomas Edison, which really propelled travelling exhibitions into the mainstream. Combined with the magic lantern, these two devices were capable of captivating large audiences from all over. The simultaneous re-rendering of both sound and visual produced something that could be described as a living scene, a realistic depiction of the outside world. Both of these technologies were captivating on their own, but when combined, they produced something that could only be described as technological realism, the reflection of the world as we know it, rendered through technology. Chief amongst these technological realists was Lyman H. Howe, one of the most neglected figures in early film history. A travelling exhibitioner, Howe's exhibitions were known for their perceived authentic sound effects, with periodicals of the time praising him for his innovative approach to sound effects. Howe's early tours were very much like his contemporaries, relying on the phonograph to produce sound in sync with images, but Howe quickly realised that the machine was incapable of rendering time-sensitive sounds, such as gunshots in synchronisation with the moving image, prompting Howe to use live sound effects generated from behind the screen. Howe's exhibits would use a combination of traditional instrumentation and sound effects created by an assortment of objects, all of which allowed his shows to be more reactive on screen. Whilst this wasn't necessarily a technological step forward in terms of the tech involved, Howe's investment in practical sound effects impressed upon an audience not only a desire to see effects that were realistic, but for the technology producing these effects to be invisible, and therefore contributed a greater sense of realism. Before Howe, the phonograph had typically been placed at the front of the screen, with a projectionist manually cranking the handle to keep it in time, breaking the illusion of synchronization between sound and image. In abandoning the phonograph, Howe not only intensified this illusion, but also generated an increased degree of technological mysticism, akin to what had driven audiences to the very first phonograph exhibits. The June 2nd, 1898 edition of the Wilkes-Barre Times praised Howe as the successor to Thomas Edison, noting that his effects had been produced in an ingenious manner which was probably known only to himself. Sounds like a right wizard to me. Howe and his contemporaries' approaches fundamentally shifted early cinemagoers' attitudes towards certain new releases. Stephen Bottomore has noted that film with unrealistic sound effects were panned by audiences. A screening of Last Days of Pompeii in 1913 was infamously panned solely for its continuous use of a motor horn effect that critics and audiences felt was unrealistic and inappropriate. Whilst early silent films had used sound effects as a means to demonstrate the technology of the effects themselves, audiences were beginning to demand effects that could impress others with their realism. This push towards films being used to demonstrate sound can be seen in the changing modes of staging in silent cinema. Just compare an early Edison film like The Kiss, which is flatly composed and has minimal action, with a later Edison film like Black Diamond Express, which was screened by Howe in 1900. By comparison, Edison's later film offers a number of opportunities to exploit innovations in sound effects. As a review of Howe's screening of the film stated, the train approaching the screen slowly gave exhibitors a chance to increase the volume slowly as the train comes towards the screen. As the review notes, rushing of the steam, ringing of the bells and the roar of the wheels all contributed to the film's realism. This fascination with realism reached its peak with the invention of sound effects units, which successfully combined the exhibition-based spectacle of the phonograph with the invisibility of live sound effects. Sound effects units came out of a dual need to appeal to audience demands and a practical need to reduce the laborious setup of numerous pieces of live instruments. Housed in one unit, multi-effects devices like the British ALFX, developed in 1909, provided operators with a multitude of effects, which could be used to enhance the audience's experience. The advancement in sound effects technology coincided with another important advancement in cinema. As the First World War came to an end, a focus began to shift toward creating the first talking pictures, which culminated with the release of The Jazz Singer in 1927, a film which ushered in the dawning of the age of the talkies. However, their legacy as a form of technological spectacle reverberated across the early sound period, as audience reactions to devices such as the Vitaphone mirrored the reactions to live effects that had occurred during the early 20th century. To this day, technological spectacle continues to be an important part of the movie-going experience. If early cinema hadn't put technology at the forefront, who knows what kind of films we might be watching. Thank you for watching this week's episode of Full Fat Videos. Whether it be video essays, movie pitches, retrospectives, or our weekly Doctor Who discussion show, you can find it all here at our channel. So don't forget to subscribe and follow us on MySpace. I mean Twitter.